Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew Dix, and I'm the founder of the Crowdfund Media Group. We're the publishers of Crowdfund Insider, and we cover all topics regarding fintech, including digital assets and digital securities. And once again, we've put together a panel of experts to discuss a very timely and hot topic, in my opinion, digital securities. So you all are here not to listen to me, but to hear from our experts. So I'm going to start by asking each panelist to do a quick introduction of who they are and what their platform does. I'm going to start with you, Matt, down at the bottom there, and just go around the room.
Thanks, Andrew. Hi, everyone. Hope you can hear me okay. My name is Matt Goldstein. I'm one of the founders of the DealMaker group of companies. I came to this world from the practice of law, spent a decade or so as a capital markets attorney. And with my co-founder, Rebecca, decided we could help clients obtain outcomes that were better, faster, and cheaper if we built a technology company. So DealMaker is first and foremost a technology company. Our mission is to provide solutions for issuers who are in the business of raising capital. And with our group of companies, they raise that capital online.
Awesome. Alan.
Terrific. Delighted to be on. Thank you very much, Andrew. Alan Konevsky, I'm the Executive Vice President and Chief Legal and Corporate Affairs Officer at tZERO. Been with tZERO for about 4 years. I came to tZERO after 20 years in the more traditional environment with senior roles at Goldman Sachs, MasterCard, and Sullivan & Cromwell, an international law firm with a focus on financial services and other highly regulated industries, payments, technology, M&A, and capital markets. tZERO is one of the pioneers in the digital asset ecosystem. Our original thesis has been that most of these assets are regulated and are, in most cases, securities. And therefore, in addition to building top-notch tokenization technology, we've also built leading regulated platforms for capital raising and secondary liquidity in private assets that utilize blockchain in a range of ways, from full digital asset securities to securities that utilize blockchain in a non-controlling way to provide transparency into a private issuer's capital structure. We work with a range of issuers and products that are fractionalized, securitized, and in some cases fully tokenized or partially tokenized. And we have been a longstanding advocate in this ecosystem for responsible regulated innovation.
Thank you, Alan. Awesome. Etan.
Yep. Etan Butler here. I'm the chairman at Dalmore Group. Dalmore is a FINRA and SEC registered broker-dealer headquartered in New York and founded in 2005. We specialize in helping companies raise capital primarily online at scale through regulations A, CF, and D. To date, we have onboarded over 260 Regulation A issuers, including a number of the more successful issuers to date, and have completed over 1 million Regulation A investments. And pleased to be here with you guys today, and look forward to the conversation.
Awesome. Okay, so let's get started here. It's my opinion, and it's the opinion of many people, that eventually or inevitably all securities will be in effect digital, or more digital than where they are today. And this has the potential to provide more and different types of utility for the securities industry, as well as different types of asset classes being able to turn into security or securitized. At the same time, we're very much at the beginning of this nascent industry. Now, recently in the news, we've had the collapse of FTX. This is a crypto exchange, one of the largest in the world, that went bankrupt. And I think it's important to kind of reflect and compare upon the largely unregulated cryptocurrency industry in contrast to the digital security industry or the tokenization security industry today, and where they are and what they're doing. As we all know, the Securities Exchange Commission believes, or at least under the leadership of Chair Gensler, that virtually all cryptocurrencies are securities, and they should have been issued under an exemption or registered with the Securities and Exchange Commission. So I kind of want to start there. And I want to go around the room and have each of you kind of share your opinion or your perspective as to what happened with FTX and what does this mean for the crypto industry and how it reflects upon the digital securities industry. And I'm going to start with you, Etan.
Yeah, so my opinion is that FTX was not regulated at least up to US standards, right? Not enough oversight. You had very little or no consumer protections and licensing requirements, net capital requirements, insurance, audits, inspections, examiners, and all the other things that SEC regulation entails. It's an example of a company, a crypto company, setting up shop, taking people's money, borrowing against it, really without much disclosure, trading against it, trading against investors, and who's left holding the bag, right? It's mom and pop investors, many of them U.S. investors who become unsecured creditors. So this is an example of a startup that could lead to a Ponzi-like scheme, ripe for criminals, to launder money and commit fraud. And it's the everyday investors who are the ones who end up feeling the pain. It's tremendously unfortunate. And if nothing is done, and this is going to keep happening again and again.
Okay. Matt, what's your point of view?
So, I mean, look, I read the news like everybody else, but my particular area of expertise is in regulated businesses, right? Like all of us on this panel here belong to regulated businesses. And so, like Etan said, what does that mean? That means, we're in a space where if customer funds are ever being held, there are strict rules. There are regular audits. There are examinations. There are detailed investigations to make sure, journal entries tie to a general ledger. There's segregation of funds. And so when I look at the world and I try to understand the mindset of the general public, and it's interesting to see the results of the poll on the right? The private investors, industry professionals, and I hear the demand from the market for solutions that are very, very fast, for solutions that are decentralized, for outcomes that are maybe outside of bureaucratic red tape. And I think to myself, and we reflect as a company, we can deliver all of those outcomes from within a regulated paradigm. We do online capital formation all day, every day. We've done some of the largest online capital formations globally from any time in history. We've done hundreds of millions of dollars online. And so, to tie back to your introduction, it's all digital. None of it's paper, none of it's in physical format. It's electronic, it's fast, settles quickly. The purchase is consummated electronically over the internet instantaneously. And so I say to myself, well, what is it people are looking for when they turn to an unregulated space, right? What is it people are looking for when they want to create communities and share ownership of a certain asset with those communities? And why is it that they're not able to use the existing regulatory framework and the technology solutions that those of us on this panel have brought to market? And I don't have a great answer, because I think a lot of the outcomes that the entrepreneurs and the investors are looking for when they venture into blockchain space, online space, unregulated space, they can get in the regulated space as well through products that are offered on our platforms every day.
So Matt, but FTX was regulated in the Bahamas. Is that a comment on the type of regulation they offer in the Bahamas?
No, I'm not going to comment on the type of regulation that they offer in the Bahamas, and that's not my expertise. So, I practiced capital markets law for over a decade, but I didn't do it in the Bahamas, and I'm not opining on the way in which those regulators examine the business under their purview. I can tell you, as someone who reads the news, the regulation of that business was not effective, and I don't think that that's controversial. Stick your hand up if you think that that's a controversial thing to say.
Yeah.
And I can tell you from the perspective of our business, we have oversight from regulators who take very, very seriously the rules around customer funds, the rules around information that's provided to investors, the capital that the broker dealers are required to maintain and hold and report on every month. And so, the world I'm in, and I think what's interesting is sometimes there's a bit of a contrast. People think the regulated world is slow. I can tell you it's not. People think the regulated world requires kind of physical transactions. I can tell you it doesn't. People think the regulated world means settlement takes days. Look at the title of Alan's company, tZERO, right? Like settlement can be instant. And so, for me, it's very interesting to have these conversations in and around FTX and to compare it and contrast it with the regulated businesses that we're all a part of.
Okay, so Alan, you operate, you're an operator of tZERO, and you mentioned that your company is a pioneer. And I agree with that because you guys were trailblazers. You did a lot of heavy lifting when nobody else was in this space. So you have kind of an interesting perspective here. Looking at FTX and comparing to what tZERO is doing, what are your thoughts on what happened with FTX, its collapse, its shortcomings in Bahamian regulation? Give me your point of view.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you, Andrew. And Matt, I think your check is in the mail. Thanks for that plug. So a couple of perspectives. One is, and it's really, really important to kind of level set on what we're talking about. Blockchain isn't crypto. Centralized crypto isn't crypto. Tokenized securities are not crypto. Securitized assets are not crypto. So people behaving badly are not like anyone else. So it's important to recognize that what happened at FTX is a function of a large organization operating with neither external rules imposed on it by regulation, nor much of an internal discipline that's imposed, whether through personnel who've ran the gauntlet of traditional finance, that's been through all of these things, or other elements of a culture of compliance and effective risk management organization. So if you're going to point the finger at anything, the last thing that should be that you should point a finger at is blockchain. And in fact, none of the bad behaviors that occurred at FTX, and I think we all read the news and we all kind of operate on what's in the public domain, has anything to do with blockchain or cryptocurrencies as such. And it all has to do with bad organization and bad behavior. The kinds of things that have happened in traditional finance for years and decades. Whether you look at Enron, whether you look at Mr. Madoff and the activities around his investment vehicles, whether you look at the 2008 financial crisis, and you had a relatively young industry with relatively young people engaging in fairly traditional behavior, right? These are very smart people coming out of traditional finance into crypto and saying, let's do X with Bitcoin. And the problem is that X is now occurring in an unregulated environment that doesn't have risk management and compliance culture that exists in a traditional investment bank, where if X were to happen, a lot of the collateral consequences that we see are less likely to occur. They still happen, there's a lot of roadkill on the highway of mainstream finance as well, but there are a lot of mitigants in place: regulatory mitigants, institutional mitigants, experience, DNA, personnel, etc. And so you take these bad behaviors, you take 100x levered transactions using customer assets, and bad things happen. And that has nothing to do with crypto or blockchain, nor does it have anything to do with the mission of creating truly public infrastructure for transacting in value in a way that's unintermediated, in a way that involves users touching directly digitally native representations of value, whether they're shares of stock, other securitized assets, or cash, that are digitally native, reside on a single public technology layer, are self-regulating, and are faster, cheaper, more inclusive, right? That's the vision. But until we get to that vision, it is critical that existing market intermediaries, regulated market intermediaries, like broker-dealers and broker-dealer operators of ATSs, and tZERO has invested a lot of time and effort in being, what we think is the leading alternative trading system for secondary liquidity of securities that leverage blockchain and either a little or a lot. And other market participants like transfer agents and others. And so I think that, if you're going to find fault with what happened, it's really with bad behavior controlling in an uncontrolled environment. And to your point, and the point that Matt made diplomatically, that behavior occurred offshore. That was not an accident. Without commenting on the Bahamas, I'd like to go on vacation there one day, and so now is not the time to make enemies. It could have been many other jurisdictions.
Okay,
and that behavior occurs offshore because of how slow positive regulatory guidance has been to develop in the United States around anything touching blockchain and financial assets.
Okay, so on that point, which I think is an important one, Etan, is legislation, the missing legislation, the aspect that needs to be introduced to create a viable industry within the United States? Yes, FTX was regulated in the Bahamas. They had bespoke regulation. They're very proud of this. I think that's great. Apparently, it also fell a little bit short here, to the tune of several billions of dollars. Before FTX fell apart, there was legislation in the works. I think it was going to be bipartisan. This seems to be kind of a back burner item right now because everybody's trying to, figure out what exactly happened. Is that what this industry needs right now, Etan?
I think so. Yeah, I don't think this is going to be accomplished from self-regulation. I think you're going to need more regulation. You're going to need more enforcement. I think the SEC has brought, I think, over 100 or so actions in crypto enforcement to date. I believe they've won them all. We saw examples of this with ICOs. We saw this with SAFTs. We saw this with crypto lending programs. We're focused on what's working today. We're, Dalmore, I think DealMaker as well, and tZERO and some of the others, there's everything feels very digital to me today. I mean, of the 260 or so Reg A clients that we have, over 50 of them are these fractional share platforms. These are companies that acquire assets, they fractionalize them, they IPO them on their platforms, they facilitate the secondary market trading of those securities, and with Reg A, there's an immediate path to potential liquidity. There's no paper there. The investor experience, the user experience is all very digital. It's all done through APIs, but it's done in a regulated way. There's a transfer agent. an SEC-approved transfer agent that ultimately maintains the cap table. Investors are protected in that way, right? A lot more so than elsewhere. So there is a path to achieving this objective that is going on today. Many examples of companies that are issuing, that are fractionalizing in a completely compliant way. So I think part of what my friend Alan was saying before, there's a language issue. I think that it's still early days, and a lot of folks look at blockchain, crypto, Web3, tokenization, and they bunch it all together. But they're really very, very distinct, very distinct from one another. There's no issue with blockchain technology. There's no issue with tokenizing a security or listing it on a blockchain, provided it's done in a compliant way. So I think that we welcome that technology. What we have to eliminate is chances of this happening again for retail investors.
Okay, so
I think regulation and enforcement, I think, is really what's needed here.
So Matt, legislation, the pending legislation, at least some of it, recognized utility type characteristics for digital assets, and was attempting to assign a regulator in the United States, and I have no idea where all that sits right now. Should we be starting with legislation that applies to digital securities first?
We have legislation that applies to digital securities. I mean, that's kind of my point, like to pick up on what Etan is saying, right? I feel sometimes like, I guess people my age will get this reference, maybe people in the audience won't, but like if you saw Gladiator, at some point, Maximus turns to the crowd and is like, "Are you not entertained?" Right? Like, what are we missing here? People want to trade. People want to be part of a community where they feel they have an ownership interest in something they believe in, right? I get that. So they go and they participate in an ICO. What about a Regulation A, right? People want to own a security that can be instantly, tradable and turned from primary to secondary. So they go offshore into a crypto exchange. What? Like, you can work with tZERO, or you can work with some of the issuers that Etan works with in the fractionalized space. So I think, when you ask, do we need regulation for digital securities? Everything that each of us on this panel do all day, every day is digital, right? If we're just talking about the non-physical world, if we're talking about the electronic world, if we're talking about the online world, everything we do is already digital. And I think, Andrew, you in particular have a role to play in this, right? There's an educational mission here. We have to educate the public around the outcomes they're looking for. We have to educate the issuers around the outcomes they're looking for, and show them that there is, a framework for this. There is a track record of success for issuers who have done this publicly, and there is a series of participants like those of us on the panel who have expertise in helping issuers and investors accomplish those objectives. So that's how I see it.
Okay, so Alan, do you think that the securities laws as they stand today, do they need any updates to accommodate? Now, so France actually wrote a new law. Whether you think it's any good or not is a different discussion. The European Union they're working on some updated rules that may or may not accommodate digital securities. Do you think there needs to be any changes in the regulation of securities?
I'm going to answer your question by answering a completely different question. So,
very politician-like.
There you go. And I see in the comments people are talking a lot about politicians. I'll kind of avoid that topic, but I'm sure folks have views, including as it relates to what's going on in the crypto markets now. Look, bad facts make bad law. Right, those of us with law degrees know that. You kind of get beaten to that, in law school, and it's largely true. The reason is because when you have an extreme situation, people don't tend to necessarily act rationally, whether it's individual or a group of individuals. And so there is a part of me that's concerned that given what has happened in the wider markets, including with FTX, but others as well, have impeded the opportunity to really have a public-private partnership and a productive conversation around should there be new regulation, what that regulation should look like, what's the right balance between positive regulation and enforcement. And that, you know, we may be in the sort of reactive salvage operation mode. And, you know, those of us who've been doing the right thing from the beginning and have been saying that these assets are regulated assets, and there's a framework that already exists for regulated assets that, to Etan and Matt's point, is automated, is electronic. People talk about bicycles and stock certificates. I mean, that's a ridiculous analogy. You know, Wall Street dematerialized, you know, 50, 60 years ago. But those rules already exist. But the opportunity for people like us may be hamstrung by the fact that there's going to be a lot of reaction, and that reaction is unlikely to be positive in the short term. You know, we do have to recognize that you kind of have three challenges. One is, what do you do with stuff that's already out there? So you have these digital assets that are out there. People thought that just because they can put the word token next to it, you know, it's sort of a get out of jail free card. Securities laws don't apply. The Howey case doesn't apply. And you can issue these assets and trade these assets, whether it touches U.S. investors or purports not to touch U.S. investors in a way that ignores securities laws and case law and SEC guidance. And so you have to figure out, and you know, there are billions of and tens of billions dollars worth of assets out there. How do you fix that? If these are illegally issued securities, how do you fix that? And in particular, how does it relate to point two is, how do you equip regulated market participants like us, an ATS operator that is approved to quote for trading digital asset securities? How do you equip us to be able to do our due diligence and start quoting a crypto security if it is far from certain that it's a good security from the regulator's perspective, but no actions have been taken? You know, there hasn't been a rescission offer, there hasn't been an attempt to register it or fit under exemption, disclosure is not available, etc. And so how do we achieve that? And it bleeds into point number three, going forward. How do you provide a new path for new products and services that people are looking to design that may leverage blockchain, including blockchain in ways that aren't necessarily that sexy from a investor end user perspective, but further automate and streamline back office operations by collapsing records onto a single database, for example, or automating certain compliance functions through the power of smart contract, and how that fits in with rules that exist around good control locations and custody requirements and other things that broker dealers have to comply with. For that matter, given the utility functions that a digitally native security can incorporate, other than just being evidence of ownership in a company, for example, you know, how do those operate? At what point does it stop being a security? You know, I agree with Matt that there is guidance, including under the Howey case, for what is and isn't an investment contract security. But you know, as you incorporate utility features, at what point do we need more guidance on how a 70-plus-year-old Supreme Court case can help answer that question? And so, and you know, whether pending legislation such as the Loomis-Gillibrand bill can help. There are other proposals in Congress. You know, power in the House of Representatives is going to change next year. What does that mean? Some of the folks who are going to be in charge of committees now have been advocates for blockchain technology. What does that mean? What does that mean from the perspective of the output from federal agencies in response to President Biden's executive order from March that tasked a bunch of people to go and do more work on digital? You know, those are all open questions.
Okay. All right. So no conclusion on whether we need new regulation or to update securities laws. I'm going to jump over to where we are.
Well, Andrew, I'll take a bit of a nuanced view on this. We definitely need clearer guidance for regulated market participants on how to do their job, particularly if it involves bringing in previously unregistered assets into the regulated ecosystem. I think that is the minimum that we need. Whether existing framework can accommodate new projects and can provide more certainty and flexibility to people as they innovate responsibly, that's a separate conversation.
Okay. So just before we jumped onto this webinar, I did a quick search about asset tokenization, digital securities, and I was looking for some quick numbers where we are today, and I stumbled upon projections, predictions, which are awesome because you can make a prediction today about something that's going to happen 5 to 10 years from now, and nobody will ever remember it. But I saw a quote where the World Economic Forum predicts that asset tokenization, digital securities, will grow to 15 trillion by 2025. I don't know. That seems like a big leap to me. I found another prediction that seemed to indicate that by 2030, the asset tokenization, digital securities, will reach over $16 trillion. And at least to me, that's a big number. And then you look at the kind of the crypto markets today, which at one point was at 3 trillion sometime last year. And now that we're in a crypto ice age, it's about 820 million, going in a wrong direction. So in my opinion, it seems to be like the digital security market is on the upswing. This is kind of the future. But where are we today, Etan? You've already discussed how you guys are already fractionalizing assets. What are you doing today, and what do you see out there in the market today?
We are enabling entrepreneurs who have an interest in issuing, fractionalizing, and facilitating the secondary market trading of all types of securities, including real estate, art, collectibles, racehorses, and revenue streams, royalties. It is my opinion that everything is going to be, all assets are going to be fractionalized going forward, and hence digitized in that way. Why? Because it allows for greater liquidity. Ultimately, it allows for, by utilizing Regulation A, for example, it allows for anyone over the age of 18, pretty much internationally, to buy shares of these assets, where you have a $10 million painting that might trade once every 2 years at an auction, right? And very few people could afford to participate. But if you issue that art via Regulation A, and you could bring the share price down to $1 a share or $10 a share, where anyone over 18 could participate, I think that brings a lot more liquidity into otherwise trapped assets. I think that applies to real estate and all assets. And one of the benefits of Regulation A, like I mentioned before, is there's an immediate path to potential liquidity, unlike Regulation D and Regulation CF, where investors have to wait a year before they could trade their securities. Regulation A is immediate, right? So there you go. I mean, the only difference is you can't just freely transfer your share to anyone else's wallet without going through some type of regulated process. So someone has to oversee to make sure that you're not transferring it to a terrorist, make sure there's no money laundering going on, make sure there's OFAC checks that are being done, right? That's the one difference. And that cannot be fully automated. That, you need to have a properly licensed compliance officer that's responsible for reviewing and approving each investment to make sure it's not in the wrong jurisdiction, the investor's 18, that someone's not signing Mickey Mouse on the subscription agreement, right? These are things that human beings need to actually get involved with. What we've been focusing on is how do you make that one step of the process that can't be automated feel automated from a user experience. right? It's 24/7 compliance, that kind of work we've been up to. So that's the fastest growing cohort of issuers that Dalmore is experiencing right now. It's these platforms, they set up apps and they issue all types of physical or digital securities, but they're securities. So investors have that inherent protection, right? It's not just some digital asset that's looking to set up an exchange, or some cryptocurrency that's looking to set up an exchange, right? And I think that's the starting point, right? Then it goes to the benefits of tokenization, the benefits or the future benefits of blockchain technology, but it needs to start with something that is kosher, that is looking out for the best interests of the everyday retail U.S. investor, and that's what we have to really be most focused on.
Yeah, and so you mentioned Reg A Plus here. For members of the audience, I'm certain everybody understands that this is a securities exemption that allows an issuer to raise up to $75 million from both accredited and non-accredited investors. And once that security is issued, it can be immediately tradable if the issuer wants to go down that path. And it can trade on tZERO, it can trade on NASDAQ, NYSE. It's a very interesting exemption that's still, in my opinion, very much at kind of the beginning of how people are using it. And you have had people, utilize it to issue digital assets, just don't throw in the term blockchain right now. But it is an opportunity, in my opinion, for digital securities. Matt, so DealMaker Tech, you guys use a lot of technology. What are you guys doing today in regards to, providing digital assets on your platform?
So I think there's kind of a couple ways we can build on that question and on some of Etan's remarks. The first one, to go back to the digitization of assets and that $15 trillion number you gave, and a lot of comments got sparked from that, Andrew. So you should know you hit a nerve. We see a huge trend, and I think it comes back to I think it comes back to something emotional about ownership. People like to own a portion of an asset, either an asset. I mean, we see it with housing. Economic theory goes up and down on, whether you should own or whether you should rent, but people want to own because there's something emotional about owning. And I think the same thing is building with assets, right? So the desire to feel connected to something as part of a community, the desire to, have some sort of a stake in something that provides an emotional benefit. I think that's tapping into something very human, very fundamental. And I agree with everything that we've said so far on this panel. We think this is going to continue to be, absolutely huge. Listen, one of the most interesting offerings we had on our platform was the Green Bay Packers. They did a common stock offering back in November 2021, and they were selling basically, it was a common stock offering with certain attributes, but it was for their fans who love that team and want to participate in that team and want to have something on their wall that says, I have a stake in this. And so when Etan talks about $1 trillion painting, or maybe you didn't use the trillion on that when you're talking about the painting, or you're talking about a fraction of a painting, right? To get that emotional feeling of, hey, I own something here. I don't own the whole thing, right? But I own a piece of it, and I feel connected to it, and I feel good about that. And somebody might own, something that I might like more, and we'll trade. Like it's really, really compelling and powerful, and we think that there's going to be a continual emergence of this asset class as something that's mainstream. With respect to your question on what do we see on the Reg A front, like it's exactly that. There's all sorts of room for the space to grow, even without bringing in new legislation, new framing. Like, do you know a brand can do a full IPO, raise the capital from their own community online using a platform, list on the NASDAQ, and never use an investment bank? Alan knows that, Etan knows that, and I know that, but does the general public know that? Do people in the audience know that? Like, the world is there. The creation of online communities, the turning of an online community into a source of capital for the issuer and giving investors a piece of ownership in something that they can hold or they can trade, and doing it using their mobile phone via a platform in a way that's safe and secure and repeatable. That world is there. And I think the more we talk about it and the more those success stories make their way into the public, the more and more mainstream we'll see this type of activity.
And it's there without the risk of the Securities Exchange Commission coming and forcing a rescission or enacting an enforcement action.
Good point. Very good point. It's there in a kosher way. Now, I'm not saying, and I've got hammered in some of these comments too, that just because we're in a regulated space, we won't see fraud. We won't see bad actors. We won't see catastrophic economic adversity, right? I'm not saying any of that. Right? The SEC is there and the framework is there, but there's always the risk, buyer beware and, fraud and bad actors taking bad action. So, fair point. I don't want to set up a contrast where in the unregulated world, it's all risk. And in the regulated world, there's no risk. There's significant risk to buying anything. Yeah, whether that's a car that might not work or
there's risk everywhere. And I'd like to make a point that under Reg CF, there's been very, very little fraud. And under Reg A Plus, you have to have your offering documents qualified by the SEC. So it goes under the SEC review, and they ask a lot of questions, and they typically, look into this quite closely, and that has a profound impact on limiting fraud. So, Alan, tZERO is a broker-dealer, ATS, which effectively is like an exchange. You also have partnered with BSTX, which is a full-blown exchange. I don't really know what they're doing right now, but today you are trading securities, including tZEROs on your platform. What else are you guys doing right now today in regards to digital securities or digital assets on your platform?
You're also forgetting that the Intercontinental Exchange and that owns the New York Stock Exchange, among other assets, became a significant investor in tZERO earlier this year, and that's a very important connectivity and partnership for us. And our current chief executive officer is one of the founders of ICE, David Goon, and that's been a transformational change, I think, for tZERO, as well as for the tokenization space. Now, as we look at what the future is going to look like with continuing unrolling of the role of blockchain in the securities lifecycle, a couple of perspectives. One is we need to figure out, again, I've made this point before, I'll make it again, it's really important, what happens with crypto securities. Because if everything other than Bitcoin and Ether are illegal securities in need of a home to trade, forget about new projects and new issuances. Just look at the stuff that's out there already that's in need of a home to trade in the United States that is kosher from a Securities Exchange Act perspective, which means that it either has to trade on a national securities exchange, and you mentioned BSCX, and I'll come back to that in a minute, or it has to trade on a venue or in a manner that's exempt from registration as a stock exchange, which in most cases is going to mean a alternative, say, trading system or an ATS. How can you equip a broker-dealer that operates an ATS to do its work, do its due diligence, figure out that it's consistent with its obligations to bring this crypto security to its investors and start quoting it? So I think guidance on that is important. Yes, we are approved for digital asset securities, and there's a path under SEC no action letter from 2020 that allows for quotation of digital asset securities that are custodied away from the broker dealer, custodied and settled away from the broker dealer. But before you get to that, if these are illegally issued securities, how do you get comfortable as a broker dealer that you can quote them for secondary trading? And so, that's really, really important, because I think it's players like us and tZERO with its leading role in the ecosystem that can have a will be really important in sorting out the right path. We've talked about regulatory underreaction or overreaction before, and sorting out what the kind of the future of existing crypto projects is going to look like in the U.S. again, with some exceptions like Bitcoin and Ether. And that's really important. Now, there's an ongoing conversation. A lot of it is tea leaf reading, whether those things should trade on a national securities exchange or should trade on an ATS, and kind of where the SEC's preference lies, including from perspective of what the SEC thinks might be differences in data, trade reporting and other aspects of an exchange versus ATS transactions. And again, ATS include, particularly our ATS, is fully transparent. Every trade gets reported to FINRA. Companies that are quoted on our ATS, if they're not subject to Reg A plus or Reg CF SEC disclosure requirements, are subject to tZERO's disclosure requirements. There's due diligence that goes into that. But how the debate between where should the bulk of kind of crypto securities end up, and where do exchanges, including exchanges like BSTX, that are at least have some recognition towards the role of blockchain and data dissemination, if not securities trading necessarily. And while there's guidance for ATSs touching digital asset securities, there isn't one necessarily for exchanges. And so, that kind of needs to get sorted out. But I think beyond that, it is our expectation that more and more of the existing electronification and automation of the securities industry, including in the private asset space, will continue to be further streamlined and improved, including through use of kind of single blockchain-based database for representations of securities in digitally native form, that's going to obviate necessarily from multiple records that are kept by multiple market participants. Doesn't mean those market participants will stop needing to have a role, but I think the role that broker-dealers play from a market surveillance perspective, for example, or customer accreditation surveillance perspective that Etan mentioned. By the way, I would never take overs and unders on what can and can't be automated, including through increasing role of AI when and if that's allowed to play a trustworthy controlling role in the securities industry. And you're probably years away. But those intermediaries will continue to play a role. But I think the technology that underpins securities issuance, custody, trading, custody, settlement, compliance, administration is going to change. I think blockchain is going to play an increasing role in that. First in private securities, because it's easier to experiment and test and learn without touching all the multiple ripple effects of what it means to change the public equities markets, for example, and all the infrastructure that's plugged into that. I mean, that's a multi-decade undertaking. Although, again, not a solution in search of a problem. There are problems in public equities as well. People talk about delayed settlement cycles and shorting and public company voting, and how blockchain technology can augment all of that. But certainly with private assets, it's easier to test and learn in a compliant way, in a more constrained environment, and that's what we're continuing.
So I agree with you that private securities is the best place to start. I also think that publicly listed securities will get there as well. There was a question asked, and I actually had it on my list because I think one of the benefits of the cryptocurrency market, going back to the days of the ICO, was liquidity. Because you could run out there and issue a Dogecoin that was based on nothing, and immediately run a pump and dump scheme, and for some reason people kind of enjoyed that. Etan, what type of liquidity are you seeing now in the securities that you are issuing, and how do you foresee that evolving going forward? Because again, we're still very early days. This is a nascent industry. It takes time, and everybody wants it to happen overnight. But I think nobody wants to lose all their money like they lost it in FTX. And so being regulated is a better path. It just may, slow things down a little bit. So what are you seeing today, Ton, and where do you think it's going?
I think we're at very early days. On the Reg A side, we've facilitated over 1 million Reg A investments, primary investments, and so far over, I think, 120,000 Reg A secondary market trades. That's mostly been in the real estate and the collectibles and the art space so far. I wouldn't say there's liquidity like one would expect on a more established public exchange. Where we're seeing most of the secondary trading is, again, on these issuers who are setting up their own apps, IPOing asset after asset in whatever their market strategy is, and giving investors the ability to build a portfolio of these assets, of these securities, and then the ability to access secondary market trading of them. So it's growing. And I think ultimately where this is heading, once there's sufficient size, is going to be bridging the gap between institutional markets and private securities, so that one day, through DTC eligibility, perhaps investors could hold and access private assets in their, let's say, Charles Schwab account, right? RIAs could open up exposure to alternative investments. That's going to take some time. It's probably going to happen first in real estate and art, because those are the most consolidated, most active kind of private securities that we're seeing run through Regulation A currently. But it's going to expand beyond that. Athlete contracts, royalties. These are all things that ultimately, once they're of sufficient size, I think we're going to see more institutional interest in. And once we see institutional interest, that opens up the path for market making, right? For better arbitrage opportunities across different platforms, perhaps even multiple ATS listings. So I think it's very, very early days. And it's not a particularly a very liquid environment on the private side yet. Yeah. But for the first time, investors now have a path to buy shares that they missed on the IPO, or list the shares that they want to get out of. And others have the opportunity to participate on the other side of that trade. So it's exciting times.
Yeah, Matt. So I think if you walk down the street, any street, anywhere, and you ask somebody, what a digital security is or what a token is, they look at you like, you're nuts. We have kind of this small world here where we kind of understand the acronyms and the definitions and what's going on. In my opinion, people just, these assets, they need a SKU, and you need to be able to log into your account anywhere, whether it's one of you guys or Schwab or E-Trade, and trade the asset, right? Buy or sell. Am I right or am I wrong?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, effectively, I think what you're describing is a really big gap between the public market infrastructure, right? You can log into your Charles Schwab account. There's a QSIP. You pick the security you want to buy. You buy it right then and there. You can trade it after it settles, and you pay for it. And that infrastructure is very, very well developed. The security doesn't physically move. It's all noted in a ledger at DTCC or Seed & Co, whatever it is. And then, your account at Charles Schwab settles with, the buyer's account from Morgan Stanley. And it's all, from the user experience perspective, very, very easy, right? And that world is completely missing in the private markets. In the private markets, Alan and me and Etan and our organizations have had to build the infrastructure for those outcomes to take place, like one brick at a time. And as Etan says, we're getting there. I think it's very exciting to see the infrastructure in the private markets build, and in some respects already be in a position to compete with the infrastructure in the public markets. Not that, outcomes in the public markets are always so great. We have plenty of issuers who do a primary with DealMaker and end up on a public exchange, and, the magic liquidity that they thought they were going to have without, casting aspersions on any of the exchanges. But that, magic liquidity isn't necessarily there either. So I think there's a lot of scenarios in which say we are able to build up the infrastructure in the private markets so that, you can, all the things that we listed in your example with your Charles Schwab account, you can do that for private securities too. Maybe we can get to a place where outcomes are even better, liquidity is even better. The community knows one another. They're used to dealing with one another. It isn't, a stranger on the other side of the transaction. It's a community member who, has bought a different fractionalized asset, and you're, trading repeatedly and, achieving that emotional idea I talked about when people can become owners of assets. So yeah, we have to build the infrastructure, and demand has to increase, and the awareness has to continue to grow, and the success stories have to continue to proliferate. And if we do all that, we'll keep fertilizing an ecosystem. That ecosystem will continue to grow. Okay,
so I have two more questions that I want to ask before we open it up to questions from the people attending this webinar. So quickly answer this thing. Is DeFi a dream? Is this vapor? And I'm going to start with you, Matt, since you were just talking. Is DeFi going to happen, or are we always going to have some sort of intermediary status?
So, I mean, okay, DeFi is not a dream. Okay, let's just, DeFi is realistic, but I hesitate to talk about, or to get too focused on like the technology around how outcomes are achieved, because for me, like, I like to step back and see what are people trying to achieve, and then the technology and the how that it's achieved will follow from that. So first, what is it people are trying to do? If we all agree on that, or if we think there's enough of a consensus around that, it's I want to become an owner in a private security, and I want to trade that security. Okay, right? I want to be able to become an owner of a private security and trade that security, and and that company's never going to go public and not incur the cost of capital of, being a public company, and the audit financials and the audit committee and all that. Okay, so it starts with what are the participants trying to achieve, and then the technology kind of flows from that.
Okay, quickly, Alan.
But it can be done centralized, it can be done decentralized, it can be done electronically, it can be done non-electronically. Like all of those worlds already exist.
C5 versus DeFi. Alan, quickly.
Shortly, you're going to see increasing use of public utility infrastructure for value. By public utility, I mean the only other public utility that currently exists for valuable stuff is cash. Right? It's there, the government prints it, anyone can take it, use it, don't need an intermediary unless you're sending over long distances or something like that, or don't want to get robbed. And so you are going to see greater focus on doing to value what Intranet did to data and voice, creating public infrastructure where natively digital representations of value can exist and people can touch them and exchange them with minimal to no intermediation. So that's DeFi, and various participants can then plug into that one set of rails through APIs in a way that's verifiable and secure, etc. Now, that's a long journey, and that's going to take a while. I also don't think that one of the reactions to people saying, whoa, hang on, centralized crypto kind of laid an egg with FTX, so let's go back to peer-to-peer transactions with user self-custody and all that other stuff. Which, remember, one of the reasons why you had centralized crypto is because policymakers and regulators didn't like DeFi part of crypto, and then forced centralization because they thought it's better from an AML perspective. I don't think that's going to happen, and so in the near term, you're going to go back to sort of peer-to-peer user self-hosted wallets, decentralized exchanges as a preferred way of doing things. I think you are going to have CeFi is going to continue. How CeFi operates is going to change, and technology will have a lot to do with it.
All right, Etan, DeFi reality?
I think we're years away. I think it's laden with risk. I think there needs to be more clear focus on the regulatory environment and rails put into place. I don't think it's a pipe dream, but I think we're far from seeing that reality unfold. We have to just make sure we keep an eye on our greatest responsibility, which is to look out for retail investors, U.S. retail investors' best interest, right? So if we could get there with offering them that as protected of an environment as we can, then I think it's a possibility. But I think it's going to take some work.
Yeah. So, okay, last question here before we open it up to questions from the participants. So if you have any questions, please enter them in the chat. We've already discussed fractionalizing art and sports contracts and real estate. And this is an area why I think is really interesting. And I call them kind of, novel assets that become securities or esoteric securities. And again, we're just at the beginning here. Alan, you've already mentioned that back office is probably the first and most immediate beneficiary of the technology. But I'm going to go back to you, Etan. You guys are already fractionalizing things. Where do you see that evolving to? I mean, big picture, where does this all go? Am I going to be able to buy a fraction of my neighbor's house and trade it on an exchange? What does the future hold?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, we have some clients that are setting up similar type structures today. You're going to be able to buy a share in your favorite athlete's sports contract, your favorite piece of art, the house around the block, the apartment building, the building that you work at. The potential for everything to be fractionalized into bite-sized shares so that anyone around the world could build a portfolio and have exposure, and there could be a potentially liquid marketplace for the further purchase and sale of those assets, of those securities. But there's a right way to do it, and that's what we're focused on. So a lot of this is talk, a lot of this is what might be, what was. We've been really busy focusing on the issuers who are doing it right today based on the current regulatory framework that's available through these exemptions. And there's many examples of them listed on our website under fractional platforms. People could look at them themselves, and they could download the apps, and they could experience it themselves if they'd like, right? Be prepared to lose what you invest in. This isn't a recommendation to purchase any securities, of course, but to see how it works and companies that are doing it the right way. There's more and more of them that are coming to market, and I think it's going to continue.
Compliance. Matt, is Etan off his rocker, or is he spot on?
No, I think earlier I talked about the desire to have ownership. I talked about the Green Bay Packers selling shares in a sports team. I completely agree. And look, go to the early 2000s. I was practicing at Wall Street law firm. We securitized everything. You wouldn't believe what we securitized. Any asset, any income stream, you could turn into a security, and that was more in the Wall Street environment where investment banks would market those securities to their wealth management accounts. But this is just the general public and the private markets catching up to something that's been around in theory for a very long time.
Alan, in the future, are retail investors going to be able to access any type of revenue stream in a security fashion on tZERO?
Yes. And I think it's going to straddle a range of types of assets, a range types of revenues from sources that aren't just financially attractive, but also create ecosystem engagement, whether it's in entertainment or sports or real estate or other industries. And so I think that fractionalization, securitization, and tokenization are separate concepts, and we got to talk about them separately. Fractionalizing, securitizing a range of unique assets that create economic opportunities that didn't exist before at a retail level, as well as engagement opportunities, and coupling them together, the velocity and breadth and depth of that in a responsible way will continue to accelerate. Tokenization, meaning leveraging blockchain technology in a way that investors care, because you're introducing new utility functions. So your share can now be exchanged for a product or a service, and an issuer can interact with you directly without having multiple layers of intermediaries, and collect data, and you receive other benefits in a real-time way from the issuer, in addition to back office improvements that people care less about at a retail level. The velocity of that will continue to accelerate, probably at a slower pace.
Okay, so I'm going to jump over to, so we have a few questions here. I'm going to ask them really quickly. The first one's going to go to you, Alan. It says, blockchain infrastructure-wise, Does tZERO have an idea where the on-chain data can be found in case someone wanted to review it a day later or a year later, particularly for digital stock lending?
So look, one of the interesting ways in deploying blockchain kind of on a spectrum, not it's either tokenized or it's not, but providing blockchain to create so-called digitally enhanced securities, which we pioneered, that are conventional securities from a legal perspective, but provide blockchain-based data as to give transparency and insight into an issuer's capital structures. You go on Etherscan, and you look under the relevant wallet addresses, and you'll see the full transaction history, for securities that are held, by the relevant holder of record. So, I know there are concerns in the securities lending industry for a long time around opaqueness of that industry and people borrowing shares that don't exist. That's one of the reasons why, there was a case a while ago in Delaware, Dole Foods, where more securities showed up to collect merger consideration than exist. Securities lending has a lot to do with that. And so blockchain can absolutely provide a solution for that for the public markets. We talked about that, a number of minutes ago.
No more naked shorting. It still exists.
Yeah. Look, we can have a separate meeting on that, but
yeah,
we look forward to a range of use cases, across public equities as well.
Yeah. So very quickly, Alan, since
I would do that meeting off camera.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So Alan, very quickly, what's the status of BSTX? You mentioned it before, somebody asked about it, and I'm actually curious about that as well.
BSTX was approved by the SEC in Q1 of this year. It was an important moment in the securities industry. BSTX was approved as an exchange that is permitted to utilize blockchain-based data. That's a first step. It's less than perhaps what the vision behind BSTX was in the beginning for kind of fully digitally native securities trading, custody, and settlement experience in the public markets. But as we talked about, public markets infrastructure, including a range of participants like DTCC, although they're working on it, and various intermediaries are just not there yet. So, but it was an important moment. It was approved, and I think management of BSTX has been looking at next steps with respect to what it takes to launch it.
Okay, I'm going to give this to you, Etan. The variety of tokenized assets, revenue streams, et cetera, is intriguing. Are we days, months, years from seeing more of these onboarded? Are there particular industries that are leading?
This is happening now. This is the fastest growing cohort of Regulation A issuers that we're seeing. And it feels like every day there are more entrepreneurs reaching out, more sophisticated companies that are reaching out. We're seeing this in music royalties. We're seeing this with racehorses, collectibles, real estate, art, precious metals and gems, sports contracts, even NFTs and digital assets, and franchises. I mean, literally, it's limited to the imagination of the issuer. So this is going on today. These are communities that are set up that are giving investors the opportunity to build portfolios of exposure for as little as $1 a share, and provide an immediate path to potential liquidity right on their own app. Right. This is all digital. This is all seamless. This is the user experience, investor experience is crisp and fast. There's no paper. So this is happening today. And yes, it's just the beginning of it, but over the last few years, is really when it started to develop, and we expect it to continue.
Matt, maybe you can address this one, because you guys are all regulated, and I kind of take that for granted. I read about this stuff all the time. Can you talk about how you must adhere to compliance as a platform? You're also a broker dealer. I can't remember if you have an ATS or not. Can you talk about how
we don't have an ATS?
How rigorous that is?
Yeah. Yeah. So the space is regulated, right? As a technology company, we provide technology that's used by broker dealers or other, or issuers to run offerings. The technology itself isn't regulated. The space is regulated. So in Regulation A, Regulation A is a framework for issuers to offer securities to the general public. And I saw Dickinson put in the comments an observation that a lot of the assets that are being purchased are, tangible real estate or art. The reality is any company can offer securities with assets backing those securities or without, just the general operating projected and future cash flow of the company. So we see companies that make drones. We see companies that are robotics companies. We see companies that are, primarily R&D and don't haven't produced, a tangible asset yet. And we have all sorts of offerings on the technology platform. We also own a broker dealer. Now that's a specifically regulated entity. We own a transfer agent as well. And so, within the group of companies, there are regulated entities and there are not regulated entities, but we're all working together in a space that's regulated. Does that help answer the question?
Yeah. So, I mean, you're regulated by the SEC, FINRA. They have regular checks. You have deal with compliance officers. It's pretty robust.
Very much so. Very much so. A broker dealer undergoes a lot of scrutiny from examiners who are experienced and detail oriented. When they look at the books and records, when they look at, if you're a broker dealer that holds customer funds, our broker dealer does not hold customer funds. But there's economic requirements around net capital. There's record keeping requirements. There's ledger requirements, and it's taken very seriously by the oversight committees, and it's a hell of a thing to be a compliant broker dealer.
Yeah, Alan, you've kind of touched on.
I've got to exit, unfortunately, because I've got some travel obligations that I can't miss. But
okay,
thank you very much for having me.
I just have a couple more questions here. Alan, you had mentioned before about all these cryptocurrencies that may need to become compliant in some form or fashion. Gary Gensler, the chair of the SEC, has consistently stated that he wants crypto exchanges to come in and register, but he hasn't really forced anybody to do that. I assume that there's ongoing discussions in the background with platforms that you may compete with at some point in the future. Are platforms like you, broker-dealer, ATS, FINRA regulated, the solution to the SEC's challenges?
Yes, and I think and we regulated secondary liquidity venues are required if these assets were to continue to have a market. We've talked about liquidity challenges before. If you are to continue to permit these assets to change hands in the secondary market, and that market to have automation and scale to it, and these are regulated securities, it needs to happen either on an exchange or on an ATS or in some other transaction that's exempt from SEC's requirements, which largely means that it can't have much scale and automation. So it does mean an ATS and exchange, but we need to be able to know that what we are taking to our customers are good securities. Now, good securities weren't before, but now are good securities from an SEC's perspective. Now, some utility tokens did go through efforts, at least initially, to do a private placement, for example. And so they filed a Form D, and there may be some ability just on a desktop basis to come to a conclusion that at least the initial offering was appropriate. In other cases, it's less easy, and the answer cannot be for each one of these things. You have to come in and have extensive conversations with the staff before you can even figure out what needs to happen to them. So some guidance on that front would be very much welcome. And it's not just an opportunity for people like us who've been saying this from the beginning. It is good for the market. And by the way, it does put us at a competitive disadvantage to participants, particularly offshore participants, who continue to make a market in these assets in a way that violates U.S. law.
Okay, so very quickly, this is the last question from me. I mentioned before several predictions about the digital security market or the asset tokenization market, and somebody had predicted that the U.S. market by 2030 would be over $16 trillion. Well, I think that's pretty big. Where do you expect it to be by 2030, Alan?
A lot bigger than it is now. Look, there was a quote that, from Bob Greifeld, that said, like, in 5 years, most securities will be tokenized, and in 10 years, every security will be tokenized. That quote is from 2017. 5 years from 2017 is now. So we're still trying to make progress towards that. I'm not going to quote numbers because, other than to make myself feel better. I will tell you that more and more assets will continue to be fractionalized, securitized, and tokenized, where blockchain technology is appropriate to improve user experience or back office handling. I think you're going to see more innovation on the private security side than spilling over into the public markets, over the next 5 to 10 years. And at some point, an inflection point will be reached where people will realize that, single technology layer, digitally native securities, self-regulating, are appropriate and trusted by society and by regulators and by the markets. And then you're going to have a tip over effect. Trying to call that, when that date is going to be is like catching a falling knife. But I think the path is moving in the right place.
Etan, last word. By 2030, 16 trillion?
No idea, but I could tell you how big is the real estate market, how big is the music industry, how big is the film industry, the royalty industry, the precious gems industry. I mean, these are just examples of what's going on today and the direction this is headed in, right? It certainly has the potential to create a lot more efficient marketplace and to open it up for more participants, for anyone over 18 to participate and have an immediate path to potential liquidity. And that's ultimately healthy for the industry, and it gives more opportunity to investors.
Awesome. So on that note, we're going to end this session. I want to thank our panelists who joined us today for sharing all your wisdom and knowledge, tZERO, Dalmore, and of course, DealMaker. And I want to thank everybody who attended today. As it's already been posted, a recording of this will be emailed out in the very near future, I think by tomorrow. Thank you very much, and we look forward to everybody attending in the future in 2023. Have a good day, everybody.